Hello, and welcome to Capital Compass. We are the official podcast of the New York State Catholic Conference. I'm your host, Gillian. Today, in episode 43, I'll be talking with David Spicer from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and Bishop Edmund Whalen from the Archdiocese of New York about immigration and religious worker visas. Throughout the 2025 legislative session, we are giving you updates on what is happening in Albany. Without further ado, here is your Legislative Minute. Welcome to the Legislative Minute. I'm your host, Gillian. Budget negotiations are beginning to heat up in Albany. Our focus this month is on securing adequate funding for Catholic schools and charitable ministries. The budget is due to be completed April 1st. Last year, it came in quite delayed, with the governor signing all budget legislation on April 20th. As always, we will be keeping a close eye on the budget as we approach the deadline. If you're interested in a more in-depth look at what's happening in the legislature, make sure you're signed up for our Catholic Action Network. We send out a monthly newsletter with updates during the legislative session. To sign up for the Catholic Action Network, visit our website, nyscatholic.org/action-center, or text CAN to 50457. Again, CAN to 50457. Joining us first is David Spicer, attorney and assistant director of Policy, Migration, and Refugee Services for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The Office of Policy and Advocacy assists the U.S. bishops with the development of migration and refugee policy positions within the context of the Church's social and moral teaching. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gillian. Great to be with you.
Now, with everything going on politically regarding immigration and refugees, I'm sure we could have enough information for podcast content to last like a month or maybe even more. But unfortunately, we don't have that much time. Today, we're focusing on the technical side of religious workers' visas, something that has been brewing since the previous administration. So could you start off by giving our listeners some background on this topic? What are religious worker visas and who qualifies for one?
Sure, I'm happy to. Religious worker visas are available to those who are coming from outside of the United States to assist with ministries here in the United States and communities across the country. Not only do Catholic parishes and other Catholic ministries rely on these foreign-born religious workers, but our brothers and sisters in different Christian denominations and other faith traditions have also relied quite heavily on these foreign-born religious workers for several decades now. Congress created the program back in the 90s, recognizing the fact that many of the existing visa pathways for employment-based immigrants weren't really well suited to the needs of religious organizations in the United States. So, in the Catholic context, for example, we of course have some priests and religious sisters and brothers who take vows of poverty, and so they don't necessarily receive a salary in kind of the traditional sense. And so for somebody who's in that situation, it can be very difficult to meet the requirements for some of the employment-based visa categories that are out there that, otherwise they might try to utilize in order to come and serve Catholic communities here in the United States. And so Congress, recognizing the value of religious workers and the contributions that they make to American society, created the program for religious worker visas to provide kind of a more streamlined and kind of a specific pathway for these religious workers outside of the United States to come and serve communities here. And since then, that program has been working quite well and has been utilized, again, by traditions across the religious spectrum in the United States. But in April of 2023, we did see a change, which made it more difficult for people, once they're here, to remain here permanently. There are a couple of different types of visas through this program. There's the non-minister or the temporary religious worker visa. This is known as the R1 visa, and somebody can come to the United States for up to 5 years on that visa. And then there's the fourth preference employment-based or the employment-based fourth preference visa. And this is one of the kind of general employment-based visas, but it's specifically geared toward religious workers and some other categories of immigrants. And with this visa, people can get a green card and they can remain here permanently. And eventually they could also naturalize as US citizens if they wanted to do that. And because of a change that occurred in April of 2023, it's now pretty much impossible for somebody who comes on that temporary 5-year visa to get a green card within that 5-year time frame and then to remain here beyond that. So because of this, people would have to come during that 5-year period, and then they would actually have to leave the ministries that they've been serving and that they would otherwise continue to serve in the United States because of the time that it's taking to get the EB4 visa and to have that green card to be able to remain here in the country.
To kind of break down this kind of visa, do only certain types of religious occupations qualify for it?
Anybody who would be employed by a recognized religious organization in the United States. So, for the Catholic context, of course, we have dioceses, we have religious orders and congregations throughout the country, and we have religious workers in all sorts of contexts, not only parish priests, but we have women religious and religious brothers working in schools and hospitals and nursing facilities and all sorts of places, not only serving our Catholic brothers and sisters, but others as well who may be benefiting from their services.
As you mentioned, this is for obviously any denomination of religion. What are the requirements to apply for a religious worker visa?
Yeah, the religious worker visa basically requires, in order for somebody to receive one of these visas, they already have to have an employer in the United States who's willing to sponsor them. So that employer in the United States would actually initiate the process in order to have the religious worker come to the United States. For the R1 visa, there are a few basic requirements, but the main thing is that the person have that organization here in the United States, that that organization be recognized, and then that the organization submit the application on behalf of the religious worker. And the religious worker basically has to have been working on behalf of that same denomination for the past 2 years prior to that application being submitted. So those are the basic requirements. I mean, the way that the program works is the US based religious organization is sort of vouching on behalf of the people who are coming to serve American communities. And so once that happens and once that organization submits that application and US Citizenship and Immigration Services verifies all of the information in the application, then that kind of clears the way for that R1, that 5-year visa for people to come. And then, of course, if the religious employer decided to sponsor that worker to remain in the country permanently beyond the 5-year period, then they can move forward with that next step in the process. And that's all, again, very, very similar because the person is either already here or is already known to the religious organization in the United States.
Later in this episode, I'll be talking with Bishop Whalen, Auxiliary Bishop for the Archdiocese of New York, about how this is impacting the religious communities. But what happens when the visa expires with all of the issues that are going on right now?
Right. The main challenge that many Catholic dioceses and parishes have run into is that for this 5-year visa, of course, like I said, under normal circumstances, somebody would be able to, we refer to it as adjusting status within that 5-year time frame. And so there's no interruption in their ministry in the United States. But it's often the case now that because people are unable to adjust status within that 5-year time frame, that they would be forced to depart the United States once they reach that 5-year period. And then, of course, they have to leave the ministries that they've been serving in, and that could be the pastor of a parish, even. A foreign-born priest could have been assigned as a pastor or as the parochial vicar or something like that of a parish. And so he would have to leave that. Well, the requirement right now under federal regulations is that somebody be outside of the United States for at least 1 full year before possibly returning on another one of those temporary R1 visas. And while all of this is going on, they can be waiting in line for that permanent visa that results in the green card that I mentioned earlier, the EB4. But it's that 1 year time frame that's really difficult for our communities in the United States because, I mean, you could probably imagine yourself, Gillian, your parish going an entire year without a pastor. That's just not sustainable. So the USCCB has requested the prior administration and will continue to request with this administration that that 1 year time frame be shortened. And that's something that the administration itself is empowered to do. The statute that is provided to kind of guide this whole program doesn't specify how long that period outside of the United States needs to be. And so the executive branch can actually make that whatever period of time it wants. And so we, as the USCCB, have requested 30 days. So that would be a shorter 30-day period between those R1 visas that a religious worker would need to depart the United States and then would just be able to return after that 30-day period is up. And that's something that's much more manageable for parishes and other ministries of the Catholic Church, and then, of course, other religious traditions that are relying on these visas.
Now, earlier you mentioned that it's a little more difficult for brothers and sisters who take vows of poverty. And I
Mhm.
know in doing research for this interview, there were also things about how, with other religious denominations, their marital status, and sometimes they will be making an income outside of their position in their
Mhm.
religious organization. So, what kind of impact does that have, like, comparatively to the Catholic Church?
There's certainly a wide variety of either expectations or sort of norms in terms of religious workers of different traditions. Obviously, within the Catholic context, we do have lay missionaries and lay ministers who may be married. We also have deacons, of course, who can be married, and those folks also utilize the religious worker visa program. In some other traditions, they may have ministers that can be married, ministers of either sex who can be married. And so that may factor into the total kind of combined income of the religious worker and his or her spouse, or if they're both religious workers, that may certainly factor into it. The religious worker visas don't necessarily have very much to do with or don't really have any limitations on the income that the foreign born religious workers could be receiving in the United States. Where this becomes difficult is, for example, there's a different type of temporary visa known as an H-1B visa. And this is something that could be available or could be an option for a foreign born priest or other religious worker, but it does have something known as the prevailing wage requirement. And so basically, the employer has to demonstrate that in order to sponsor a foreign employee for this H-1B visa, that that employer is going to pay the person the prevailing wage for that type of occupation in that region of the country. And this can be difficult for Catholic priests, for dioceses that are employing Catholic priests who may not be making as much as religious workers or people who are in kind of that same occupation. It's kind of difficult to think about sort of Catholic priests being the same as ministers in other religious traditions because there are distinctions, of course, in terms of how we view priests and how some other traditions view their ministers. But that prevailing wage requirement can be difficult, even for a diocesan priest who does receive a salary from the diocese, however modest that salary may be, because the diocese then, in order to utilize that H-1B visa, of which there's only a limited number, and so it's not a guarantee that they could do that. But in order to do that, they would have to potentially pay that foreign-born priest more in order to meet that prevailing wage requirement than they would be normally paying a priest in that position who was born here in the United States. And so obviously this creates difficulties within dioceses and within the presbyterate, the priests, community of priests within a diocese, because it creates sort of discrepancies between them. And that's just for those that, of course, do receive a salary. As we mentioned, there are clergy and religious within our tradition who don't receive a salary and they're supported by their communities in other ways, but they then wouldn't be able to meet that prevailing wage requirement, and so they couldn't use that visa at all. So that's kind of what I was getting at when I mentioned that there are some challenges with using certain other visa categories.
I think it's important to highlight that the religious workers visa is such an issue for the Catholic Church because, as you were saying, there are not necessarily as many options for Catholic religious workers.
Right, and this is something that other traditions struggle with as well. We are very blessed in the Catholic tradition to have here in the United States seminaries across the country where we form priests, And for other ministers of the church or other religious workers, we do have formation programs for sisters and brothers and folks who serve the church in ways other than the priesthood. But there are some traditions, such as the Eastern religions, Buddhists and Hindus and others, who don't have those domestic institutions of formation. And so the only way that they can exercise their faith here in the United States, which is obviously very important to us as Americans and something that's enshrined in the First Amendment, is for them to have religious workers come from outside of the country. And so their ability to rely on the religious worker visa program is in some ways even more crucial than it is for us, given that we do have those domestic institutions of formation. And even with the fact that we have seminaries and domestic formation programs, we have to keep in mind how diverse the church is here in the United States. And of course, you being in New York and having the Archdiocese of New York and other really diverse dioceses know that we have Catholics who speak many different languages and have many different cultural ties. And it's really valuable and essential in many ways for us to be able to have priests and other religious workers who reflect these same languages and cultures so that these people can live out their faith to the full extent. And so that's another part of this too. It's not just because we don't have enough domestic religious workers available, although that is unfortunately a challenge across the country in many ways, but we also rely on the linguistic and cultural expertise of a lot of the religious workers who are coming through this program.
Now, USCCB has been pushing for religious workers' visas reform, obviously, as we've been talking about this. But how
Mhm.
important is the church's role in pushing for these changes? How has the church responded to the broader immigration crisis in the U.S.?
I think the church has long played a very important role in the conversation regarding immigration reform and the need for an immigration system that furthers the common good in the United States. The bishops themselves have long advocated for what we often hear of as a comprehensive reform of the US immigration system. Of course, there are several different principles that kind of underscore the church's approach to this, and I know that we don't have time to go through all of those, but when it comes to the religious worker visa program, this is very consistent with the bishop's call for legal pathways that work not only for immigrants themselves and pathways that are realizable so that immigrants can actually know that when they seek to go through the legal process of immigrating to the United States, that they can do that and that their application will be processed in a timely and efficient way, but also consistent with the bishop's desire to have an immigration system and immigration pathways that work for American communities and American families. And we've talked a lot about how Catholic dioceses and parishes and other ministries rely on these workers. And it's not just those ministries themselves, but it's the people who turn to those ministries for support. That could be pastoral support, it could be support for the social services that are provided by the church, the charitable works of the church. And so when we talk about our immigration system, of course, it's very easy to get caught up in sort of the rhetoric about the border and what we're seeing about people who may be here unlawfully and have committed crimes or pose some other dangers to the country. But I don't think there's any disagreement between the bishops and those who are calling for people to be held accountable when they pose some sort of threat or risk to the public safety or the common good. But what we have, unfortunately, is an immigration system that doesn't fulfill the purposes that it was created to fulfill in providing opportunities to legally come to this country and for those that are coming to reunify with family or to fill one of the many jobs that we have available here and are going unfilled. So I think these are the sorts of things that the bishops are consistently and regularly seeking to remind our lawmakers about and are working to support bipartisan conversations related to as Congress tries to think through what its role is and how it can work to improve the immigration system.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Joining us now is Bishop Edmund Whalen from the Archdiocese of New York. Bishop Whalen is a Staten Island native. He was ordained a priest in 1984. In 2019, he was appointed as an auxiliary bishop and the vicar for clergy for the Archdiocese of New York. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gillian. It's great to be on with you.
Now, earlier in this episode, we had David Spicer from USCCB on speaking about the technical side of immigration and religious worker visas. I'd like to speak to you about the impact this is having on our communities. So, Bishop, you have called attention to how this visa issue could jeopardize ministries in the U.S. Could you dive deeper into what would happen if these foreign-born priests were forced to leave?
Yes, well, it's not only an issue of were, it's an issue of is, and all throughout the United States, we're really being encumbered and suffering from this because, as you may have seen in the Wall Street Journal article about one of our priests, Father Luis Silva, who came here, was educated here, ordained for the Archdiocese, and then because of the way the visa system works, he was still on the R1 and working towards the green card and eventual citizenship. Because of the problems in obtaining R1, the complicated problems that exist, which I'm sure have been explained, we are having priests having to leave the country. We presently have a number of priests who've had to leave. They're priests of the Archdiocese canonically, and also priests who are still members of either religious orders or externs from other dioceses, who, because of the backlog and the R1 visa process, have had to go home, and therefore we don't have anyone to replace them. Add to that because of the backlog in R1 visas, it's hard to get priests in from other countries. We're at a really critical moment because, as always in the Church of the United States, we've relied so heavily on immigrant clergy within this nation of immigrants. For us here on the East Coast, that's especially true as sort of a point of entry throughout the history of the Church here in the States. And people suffer, and especially those in communities that need a priest who speaks the language of the community. For us here, in particular, that's both Spanish and French, because we have so many recent immigrants who are Spanish speakers from throughout the world, and we're receiving a large group and a growing group of French-speaking immigrants from Africa who are coming because they're being persecuted for the faith. So they come here, and we have what I think is a persecution in terms of an inequity in the R1 visa process.
You kind of already touched a little bit on this, but how has this crisis impact immigrant communities? As you said, some of these immigrant communities rely on having mass and other things said in their language, especially in underserved areas.
So you're talking about an immigrant population, which no matter what language they may speak, there's the similarity of everyone, my own immigrant family coming in. So you come here because you have to, and you're looking for a better life, and you're looking to be able to live in freedom and be able to have the opportunity to let your family grow. Well, an essential part of that is the faith of that immigrant family. For us as Catholics, that's very important that they become part of an immigrant parish. Parish communities here throughout the Archdiocese of New York, throughout the metropolitan area, and all the various dioceses here have vibrant parishes that welcome the immigrant community. Essential to that is a priest who speaks their language and understands their culture, so as to be able to help them grow in faith, and especially in these difficult days for immigrants, and where there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation. There's a lot of anxiety for the young people who may be the first generation born here in the United States. They need priests who understand them and whom they can understand. And this problem is preventing that effective ministry from happening.
Now, if the visa crisis continues, what do you think the future of U.S. parishes will look like? Will the church have to adapt in ways we might not anticipate, with a significant portion of the Archdiocese of New York's clergy being foreign-born? How would this potential departure of these priests impact parish life and services?
Well, as a church, we've been adapting since Pentecost. Part of being a Catholic means here comes everybody and roll with the punches. So we'll figure it out. It is just very unfortunate and really unjust that this R1 visa, which, as I'm sure has been said before, is particularly used by the Catholic Church. Other denominations, the ministers may hold secular jobs, and therefore they may come in on another visa. Well, with us, it has to be the R1, the religious worker, both for priests and for religious. One of the other concerns we have is the wonderful work and the essential work that is done by religious sisters, bringing that maternal side of the church to what they do as religious sisters in the community. And as we know, from Mother Cabrini right on through the tremendous work that it was done by women religious and immigrant communities, we're also suffering because of that. Because that very real and encouraging and reassuring presence of religious and priests is being denied to them because of this backlog and this logjam in the visas, which could very easily be solved if the government wanted to.
This actually is a great segue into my next question. As you mentioned earlier, there was a Wall Street Journal op-ed published at the end of January about the Catholic Church's immigration crisis. The article specifically mentioned Father Luis Silva, as we mentioned, from the Archdiocese of New York, who has been running into issues through no fault of his own due to the recent immigration system error, which has created a 11-year backlog for religious workers. Can you kind of break down how this has affected religious workers like Father Luis? Why has the U.S. immigration system struggled to keep up with this growing need for foreign priests? What are the specific regulations that are causing these delays?
Well, the delays, of course, really by administrative backlog, much of which the legal people could explain better than I. But from what I understand, one of the many issues, everyone blames everything on COVID. Well, it's over. Let's get back to work and let's figure out how to get it done. I don't know if there's a real volition to do that because there's a lot of people who don't like the Catholic Church, to be quite honest, and a lot of people don't like to say that, but I think we need to put it on the table. There's also the issue that many other people who are not in the category of R1 were added to that category so as to expand the number of available visas. But from what I understand, and the lawyers can correct me, that pushed down some other people who are in the hopper for the R1 visa, who are in the category they should be. They get sort of moved back for other people who were put into the category, and this isn't the proper category, but it was done so as to get them visas. Well, let's have everybody in their right spot and let's be able to serve the community, because some of those very same people who may have been put into the R1 category so as to get other visas now are not served when they get here in something that is essential in their life. We talk about essential workers. The work of the church is essential, and we see that in society. The presence and the activity of the church as a community of faith is essential to the good of society. We have held that since the Roman Empire. And the failure to recognize that is a failure on the part of the government to see what our people truly need. And I think people are telling them that. There's a real desire for faith and a real hunger for the stability given by faith among all different people. I see it walking every day to the Chancery office from where I live in the rectory here in Manhattan. It's about a half-hour walk. I'm stopped all the time by people. Hey, Father, I'm not a Catholic, but. Okay, so people are looking for something. And by failing to fulfill the obligation to the common good, by being willing to provide those visas in the way they should be, is a failure of the people responsible in the government to provide for our people. And that's an injustice to people who already have enough injustices in their lives.
I think I really want to highlight when you mentioned that you have people coming up to you saying, "Hey, I'm not Catholic," but the fact is that Catholic charities, well, I mean, obviously the Catholic Church, but also like Catholic charities and all of the other organizations within the church help people no matter what their religious denomination is.
Exactly. And just a little thing on the side there. I find it unfortunate that all too often, even ourselves, we have the Catholic Church and Catholic Charities. Catholic Charities is an arm of the church, and Catholic Charities needs to remember it's a lot more than just any other social service organization. So it's an essential arm of who we are in the church, not a separate entity. And always with the church, every parish, because parishes are taking the initiative on their own, and they're working with a number of different groups. For instance, we have here Cabrini Immigrant Services, continuing the great work of Mother Cabrini. That's not a part of Catholic Charities. There's all kinds of groups coming together. And again, the parish is the focus of the church throughout the world. They're coming together to serve the needs of people who are living and worshiping and growing as a community of faith in the structure of a parish, to be able to say, let's serve people's needs. And that includes the non-Catholic population, because we're all made in the image of God.
Now, if the visa crisis continues to affect the Catholic Church, what long-term solutions could the church explore to maintain a steady supply of clergy? Obviously, a lot of dioceses are having issues with low entry into the seminary.
Right. One of the things I think we need to be careful of as a former seminary rector, we can't apply a business model, a solely business model. You know, the church, there's an aspect of the business world in the church, but the church is not another business. And once we do that, we go down a very dangerous path. We need to remember that we have to encourage vocations, pray for priestly vocations, and accompany young people who are discerning a vocation to the priesthood or religious life. So we need to accompany young women who are looking into religious life as religious sisters, or we need to accompany young men thinking of religious life either as a brother, a religious priest, or a diocesan priest. And to be able to say, especially in the immigrant communities, because they have always been strongholds of vocations, that yes, you want your children to be successful. The greatest success is serving God and other people.
Now, as you kind of mentioned earlier, the church is always adapting and changing. Do you foresee this crisis potentially as changing the face of the church in the U.S., you know, especially in terms of diversity of its clergy and the challenges they face?
We have put that in the future. That's already the present. The face of the clergy, the face of the church has always reflected who's here, because that's who we are. And sometimes we kind of think that, you know, priests look like me. Okay, and I know this is something on the radio, but it's you know, they don't have the Irish face that I have. The vast majority of our people and the vast majority, therefore, of our clergy, thank God, reflect the various immigrant groups who've come in from all over the world, and that's what we've always done.
Did you want to add anything else about this religious workers visa issue?
I just urge everybody to first pray for vocations, encourage vocations. We need to encourage vocations from the vocation should come from the community primarily. We should never solely rely on sisters, brothers, priests coming from other countries. We need to produce our own. We've done a great job of that in what we used to call mission countries in Asia and Africa, where now the native clergy, as we call them, rightly are the ones who are there because they've done so well with it. They're supplying us, who used to send missioners to them. Second thing is we need to make our voice heard to our government leaders, both those who are elected and those who are in the various offices that handle immigration, and let them know that we need this and we need this done correctly. And third, we need to remember that we all stand together, okay, for what is truly the dignity of the human person and true justice. Not I got to get what I want, but my proper relationship with God. The word justice is from the Hebrew word sadak, which is the word for my proper relationship with God. If each of us makes sure that we're living in our proper relationship with God, then justice will come, because then all of us together see that God is at the center of our society, whether we call him that or not. God is at the center of our society, and we seek to build each other up.
You have called on Catholics to write letters to their representatives, as you also just mentioned, but sometimes people don't necessarily want to contact their representatives. Can you explain to our listeners why this letter writing campaign, or honestly just even contacting their representatives, is so important and how it can make a difference in addressing the visa crisis?
We need to let them know what we need. They work for us. And so it's our responsibility to tell them what we need, not just to elect them and then complain about them. So unless we give them some guidance, give them some insight into what our situation is on all sorts of things, then we can't complain if they're not doing what we need. Second is, you know, when suddenly your mass, okay, so I've gone to the 9 o'clock mass forever, and now there's no 9 because we had to combine masses in my parish. Well, the reason was because we don't have enough priests. The reason the parishes have to combine is we don't have enough priests to minister in those parishes. So we need to step up and recognize that, as has been said, you know, without the priest, there's no Eucharist. Without the Eucharist, there is no church.
That is absolutely true. Thank you so much, Bishop Whalen, for coming on the show.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody in the conference for what you do for our people. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Capital Compass podcast, and thank you so much to David and Bishop Whalen for coming on the show. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be coming out with a new episode the last Wednesday of each month. If you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And to catch all the latest from the conference, you can follow us on Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter, at NYS Catholic Conf. and on Facebook at NYS Catholic Conference. Thanks again, and God bless.